All right, so imagine this. You're stepping off a ship
Okay.
back in the 1600s, landing on the shores of, what we know as America today.
Right.
But instead of being met with, hostility, you're welcomed
Yeah.
by the native people who live there.
Mm.
And they're, ready to trade and share,
Wow.
their knowledge of the land.
That's
It's a very different
very
vision of early America than what we're, usually taught.
right. Yeah, very different.
Well, that's exactly the kind of vision that this guy, Thomas Morton, had.
Okay.
He was this guy who really challenged the Pilgrims,
Interesting.
and he dared to imagine a very different America.
Ah.
So today, we are diving deep
All right.
into his story,
Let's do it.
and we're going to be using excerpts from NPR's Throughline podcast,
Okay.
and specifically their episode called The Man Who Wrote That Book,
Mm.
which is all about Thomas Morton.
Okay.
Now, he wrote this book called New English Canaan, and it really got under the skin of a lot of people back in the day, actually to the point where it was banned.
Oh, wow.
The book was banned.
That's wild.
So to really understand his story, I think we need to kind of set the scene a little bit.
Okay.
So we're going back to the early 1600s.
Right.
The Pilgrims, they've just arrived in Massachusetts,
Yeah.
on the Mayflower.
Yeah.
And I think we often kind of have this image of them landing on these, empty shores. But that's obviously not the reality.
Right. Of course not.
The Wampanoag people had been living there for centuries,
Exactly.
thriving.
Yeah.
And, and this is where I think things get a little bit complicated.
Okay.
Because the Pilgrims came, with their own very strict religious beliefs.
Right.
And they had, a very specific vision for the kind of society they wanted to build.
Uh-huh.
And they weren't really, looking for peaceful coexistence. They were there to establish their own way of life. And often that came at the expense of the indigenous people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So into this already complex situation walks Thomas Morton.
Okay.
He shows up a few years after the Pilgrims.
Okay.
He's a lawyer. He's a businessman.
All right.
And definitely a thorn in the Pilgrim side from the very beginning.
Interesting.
He really wanted to capitalize on the fur trade, but he had a very different approach than the Pilgrims.
Okay.
He respected the Wampanoag.
Okay.
He saw them as, partners in trade, essential for success in this new world.
Interesting.
And he was definitely a shrewd businessman.
Yeah.
But there also seems to have been a genuine appreciation, I think, for the Wampanoag people and their culture.
Yeah.
He was more willing to kind of engage and learn rather than impose his own views.
Right.
So Morton, he sets up his own trading post.
Okay.
He calls it Marymount.
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 I like it.
And it's not too far from the Pilgrim settlement at Plymouth. And it very quickly becomes this major point of contention.
Mm-hmm.
The Pilgrims are all about piety,
Yes.
strict social order.
Right.
Morton's all about revelry
Okay.
and less rigid approach to, religion.
Right.
He would even invite the Wampanoag to join in on the festivities
Oh, wow.
at Marymount.
Huh. So the Pilgrims were not happy.
Not happy at all.
I can imagine.
They saw this as a direct challenge to their authority and to this society that they were, so carefully trying to build.
Right.
And Morton's approach completely undermined their control.
Yeah.
And it really offered this, starkly different vision for how things could be.
For a different way of life.
And then the incident that, really sets things off
Oh, here we go.
is the infamous maypole incident.
All right. The maypole incident.
So Morton decides to erect this maypole at Marymount,
Okay.
which, was this symbol of celebration. But to the Pilgrims, they saw it as paganism and heresy.
Oh, wow.
So there's dancing, there's drinking,
Yeah.
there's, general merriment,
Mm-hmm.
and the Pilgrims are just aghast.
Yeah.
I mean, they saw this as a complete rejection of their values.
It's funny how a maypole can become such a focal point,
It's like a symbol.
It's really a symbol of just how different their cultures were.
Yeah, and their ideology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was really pushing for a more inclusive, tolerant way of life.
Yeah.
And the Pilgrims were intent on enforcing this rigid,
Their own authoritarian
authoritarian system.
Yeah. And so it's not enough that he's having this big party that's, scandalizing the Pilgrims.
Of course not.
He then starts writing satirical poems
Oh, no.
that mock them.
Really?
And he even called their leader, William Bradford, Captain Shrimp.
Oh, he did not.
Oh, he did.
I can only imagine how that went over.
They were not amused. So not once,
Yeah.
but twice, they arrest him and banish him from the colony.
Wow.
Talk about persistent.
He just keeps coming back.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess each exile kind of fueled his determination to tell his story, you know?
Yeah, to get his side out.
Yeah.
And that's actually where his book, New English Canaan, comes in.
Okay.
You know, it became his platform to challenge the Pilgrim narrative.
I mean, how could he not after all of that?
Right.
Yeah.
And he describes the Wampanoag as more civilized and humane than the colonists. He criticizes the Pilgrims' very strict religious practices.
Yeah.
And lays out his vision for this more cooperative, mutually beneficial relationship with the native people.
And this wasn't just like a historical account, right?
No, it was more than that.
Like, he was really going for something bigger.
He really dives into, like, the economic potential of the New World.
Oh, interesting.
The opportunities for trade, the resources that are available.
Right.
It's almost like he's creating, like, this alternative blueprint for colonization. One that's based on partnership, not exploitation.
Yeah, that's a very different approach.
Very different.
Than what the Pilgrims were doing.
Yeah, which is why it was so dangerous to them.
Right.
You know, it challenged their whole justification for being there.
Undermine them completely.
Their claim to the land, their vision for the society they wanted to build.
Right,
You know, they really recognized the power of his words to sway public opinion back in England.
Of course.
And that terrified them.
It would.
So they did what any power structure does when it's threatened.
What's that?
They try to silence him.
Ah, yes, the classic move.
They send agents to London to try to stop the publication of New English Canaan.
Really?
They're seizing copies of the book, like, as it's being printed.
Wow.
It's considered the first book ban in America.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
Yeah, that's chilling. It is. It's a reminder that this battle over narratives, it's not just about words.
Right.
It's about power.
It's about control.
Whoever controls the story controls how people perceive history and ultimately, you know, controls the future.
Wow.
But Morton, he was not a guy to be easily silenced.
Oh, I like him already.
So he finds another way to get his message out.
Okay.
He publishes his book in Amsterdam.
Amsterdam.
Yeah, which was like a place known for its intellectual freedom at the time.
Right, right. So interesting. Yeah, he wasn't going to let them win that easily.
No, he was not.
Good for him.
But, you know, while he's over in Europe fighting this battle for free speech, things back in Massachusetts are kind of spiraling out of control. The tensions between the colonists and the Native American tribes, they just boil over.
Okay.
And it erupts into the Pequot War in the 1630s.
Pequot War. Okay.
And this war was just devastating.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most horrific events was this massacre at a Pequot village in 1637.
Oh, wow.
Where hundreds of people,
oh my God,
mostly women and children, were either burned alive or shot trying to escape.
Oh, that's terrible.
It's a really grim picture of the violence that engulfed the region.
Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking to think about.
Yeah.
And it's also kind of tragically ironic.
Okay.
Because this escalation of violence happens right as Morton's book, which advocated for peaceful coexistence, is finally published.
Oh, wow.
It makes you wonder, like, what could have been different?
Yeah, how things might have unfolded.
If his message had gotten through.
Yeah, if people had actually listened.
Yeah.
It really highlights how important, you know, these different narratives are. Because, you know, the dominant narrative, the one that painted the native people as savages.
Yeah.
That's what led to this, you know, violence and displacement. And Morton's narrative, it offered a different path. Yeah.
More humane path.
Yeah.
But it got silenced.
Yeah.
It got drowned out.
So amidst all of this turmoil,
yeah,
Morton decides to return to Massachusetts in the 1640s.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah?
He went back.
He went back.
Wow.
He's in his 60s at this point.
He's not giving up.
No, he's not.
Okay.
But what he doesn't know is that his book has actually made it back to the colonies before him.
Oh, he has no idea what's waiting for him.
No, he is walking into
It's going to be good.
A hornet's nest.
I bet.
So the colonists have gotten their hands on New English Canaan.
Yeah.
And they are furious.
Of course they are.
They see it as a complete betrayal.
Yeah.
An attack on their character, their mission, everything they stand for.
Right, right.
And they're not just angry about the content.
Right.
It's the fact that he dared to challenge their authority.
Yeah.
He dared to offer this alternative perspective.
Exactly.
That could undermine their whole control over everything.
It's the power of ideas that they're afraid of.
Yeah.
It always is.
So they arrest him as soon as he steps foot back in Massachusetts.
Oh, no way.
This is his third banishment.
Third time's the charm.
Right.
Yeah.
This time, they ship him off to Maine.
Maine.
Which was this really remote outpost at the time.
Okay.
Essentially leaving him to die alone.
Wow.
It was kind of a tragic end,
Savage.
for this man who dared to dream of a different America.
Yeah.
But thankfully, his story doesn't end there.
Okay, good.
His ideas,
Yeah.
thankfully, did not die with him.
I'm glad.
Centuries later, his book and his story are rediscovered
Oh, that's great.
by some pretty influential figures, including Nathaniel Hawthorne and John Adams.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
What did they think about it?
Well, Hawthorne, he's the author of The Scarlet Letter.
Right, of course.
He was clearly captivated by Morton's story.
Oh, yeah.
He even wrote this short story called The Maypole of Merry Mount,
Oh, I didn't know that.
which, reimagines that whole Maypole incident.
Okay.
And he actually portrays Morton in a very sympathetic light.
Interesting.
Contrasting the joy and freedom of Merry Mount
Right.
with that, somber and oppressive atmosphere
Yeah.
of the Pilgrim settlement.
It's incredible to think about,
I know.
like this banned book, this silenced voice, it finds its way back into the conversation centuries later.
And it's not just Hawthorne.
Yeah.
Even John Adams, who was one of the founding fathers, was really intrigued by Morton's ideas.
Huh.
He actually wrote to Thomas Jefferson about New English Canaan.
Wow.
Recognizing the significance of it, challenging that traditional narrative of early America.
It's like this reminder.
It is.
That even the quietest voices, they can still be heard eventually.
Yeah.
That history can be reshaped.
Yeah. History is constantly being reinterpreted and reshaped.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's really the heart of what we're trying to do with this deep dive, right?
Oh, really?
We're trying to uncover these forgotten stories,
right?
These alternative perspectives,
and
see what they can teach us
exactly
about our past,
about the present,
and maybe even about ourselves.
It's a reminder to be more, critical of what we read, what we hear,
and to question those dominant narratives.
Yeah, and to seek out those voices that have been, pushed aside,
marginalized.
Yeah.
So, what does all of this mean for us? Today, why should we care about this guy who was banished from Plymouth Colony over 300 years ago?
Well, I think Morton's story really reminds us that history, it's never really settled.
Right.
It's always being shaped and reshaped.
By who's telling the story?
By the stories we choose to tell.
Right.
By the voices that we choose to amplify.
And those choices have real consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, look at the Pequot War.
Sure.
That conflict was fueled, at least in part, by this narrative that Native Americans were savage obstacles to progress.
Yeah.
And Morton offered a different story.
Right.
One of coexistence and cooperation.
Yeah, a different path.
But that wasn't the story that won out.
And, this whole struggle to control the narrative, to silence dissent, that didn't end in the 17th century.
No.
I mean, we see it happening all around us today.
It's almost eerie how many parallels there are between Morton's time and our own.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the debates we have today over what should be taught in schools.
Right.
The efforts to ban books.
Absolutely.
The spread of misinformation online.
Right.
These are all kind of echoes of that same impulse to control what people think.
Control the narrative.
Control what stories they're allowed to hear.
Exactly.
But it's also a reminder that we're not just passive recipients of history.
Right. We have agency.
We have a role to play.
We can make choices.
In shaping the narrative.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Amplifying the voices that have been marginalized.
And Morton's own story shows us that, his book was suppressed, he was banished.
His voice was silenced.
But then centuries later, his ideas resurfaced.
Yeah.
They inspired new generations.
To question the traditional narrative.
Exactly.
So what can we do? What actions can we take to be more like the people who rediscovered Morton's work?
Yeah.
And less like those who tried to silence him?
Well, I think we can start by being more critical consumers of information. Okay. Question the dominant narratives.
Yeah.
Seek out diverse perspectives.
Be open to ideas that challenge our assumptions.
Exactly.
We can support institutions like libraries and universities that champion intellectual freedom.
Absolutely.
And speak out against attempts to censor or suppress information.
Yes, definitely.
And we can be more aware
Yeah.
of the stories that we choose to tell.
Yes.
The voices that we choose to amplify.
Make a conscious effort
Yeah.
to share the stories of those who have been marginalized.
You know, it's like that old saying.
Yeah.
Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Right.
But I think it's more than just remembering.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the complexity of the past.
Yes.
The different perspectives.
The paths not taken.
The paths not taken.
Exactly.
And using that understanding.
Yes.
To hopefully build a more just and informed future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So we encourage you to learn more about Thomas Morton.
Yeah.
And his, really fascinating but often overlooked place in American history.
Absolutely.
You might even want to try to track down a copy of New English Canaan.
Yeah.
Online or at your local library.
It's worth the read.
And if you enjoy these deep dives into history
and
the power of ideas,
the unsung heroes,
make sure to subscribe to the deep dive.
Yeah.
For more fascinating stories and unexpected insights.
We'll keep bringing you those fresh perspectives.
We'll keep exploring those hidden corners of knowledge, those silenced voices.
That can help us better understand our world.
Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.